Hey guys. So we are heading into I guess the third week of class, the second full week of class, heading toward our midterm exam coming up here in just a few days. And we are at an odd spot in terms of the course goals and in terms of the material. Okay. Now, our course goal, as you know, because you've all dutifully watched and taken notes on, I know, those video lectures that I put up here a week or so ago. Okay. The course goal is to examine how the comic book gave rise to a figure that became so central and is so central to American consciousness, that of the superhero, and how that figure reflects American ideals or dreams or fears or what have you to such an extent that it is so interwoven into the fabric of American culture now. Okay? So that's the course goal. And we've talked about the beginnings of the comic book superhero. We had what I thought was a really good discussion about Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman at our last real-time class meeting. I'd love to re-emphasize all that stuff that we wrote on the board, so much that I had to go around and erase the boards and then write stuff on them again. You notice all that came from you? All of that came from you. I may have done some interpreting, and I might have said, well, let's hook this idea with this idea. But all that stuff started with you. So you did it. You are driving this course. And that gratifies my teacher's heart. And I hope that it continues. I'm confident that it will. All right. So that having been said, we're at an odd place right now in terms of the history of the comic book and the history of how the superhero becomes so central to American consciousness. You've hit page 213 in Gerard Jones's book, Men of Tomorrow. Okay, so your assignment now, one of the reading assignments, in addition to comic books that I will list in our reading assignment section, is to finish Jones's book. You've got about 120, 130 pages to go. Okay, you've read more now than you have still to read in the book. The part you've just finished, you've got to page 212, 213, represents the last historical point at which Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were functioning together as the creators of Superman in a positive, productive, good for themselves and good for everybody else kind of way. World War II starts, comic book people start getting drafted, as people from every other field were getting drafted, okay? And as the war wears on, Jerry Siegel in particular, the writer, and you'll read this in Jones's book, Jerry Siegel starts getting stronger and stronger and stronger ideas that national periodical publications, eventually DC Comics, is planning to screw him and his partner Joe Shuster, as indeed they are. And as you'll read, coming out of the war, Siegel and Shuster hook up with an attorney who says that he is going to lead them on a golden path. Basically, they are going to sue the hell out of DC Comics and win. And so they sue DC Comics and wreck the hell out of their own lives and careers. Because what they get in the end is a judgment that scarcely covers the legal fees they have incurred. And at that point, Siegel and Shuster and DC Comics all go their separate ways. Okay? Now, the war ends and we get into the late 40s and we get into the early 50s. And here is when one of the weirdest things happens. A cat named Frederick Wertham, a German Jew who has never one to advertise his Jewishness, who has immigrated to the United States, as so many folks did. Frederick Wertham is a psychiatrist, and he is a force for social good throughout most of the 40s, and I don't know exactly when he came to the U.S. I could look it up, but not right now when I'm doing this lecture. He's a force for social good. He helps poor kids. He sets up clinics in inner New York City so that children who cannot afford medical care can get medical care. He advocates for legislation to help poor families. He is a force for a liberal, progressive, helpful, even futuristic agenda. And then something happens. Nobody quite knows what. But Frederick Wertham decides, apparently on a dime, that comic books are the root of all evil. And Frederick Wertham's book that comes out in the early 50s, Seduction of the Innocent, murders the comic book industry. And it is never quite recovered, actually. Superheroes go the way of the dinosaur almost immediately. Through most of the 1950s, the only three superheroes that remain in publication are Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And their adventures in the 50s are, to use an intellectual term, stupid. They're just outright stupid, okay? The comic book industry never quite recovers. But then something weird happens, okay? Now, usually comic book people call the introduction of Superman up until 1958. They call that the Golden Age. But it wasn't. 1937 through about 1949, 1950. That was a golden age for comic books in terms of making lots and lots of money. Okay? The very late 1940s, 1950 through the end of the 50s is not a golden age because the comic book industry has been gutted for a number of reasons. A big one being Frederick Wertham's book and the attention that it garnered, congressional hearings and all that kind of stuff. Most of the 1950s is more like the mid-17th century of Renaissance England. If you've taken my Shakespeare course, you'll know that the 1640s through the 1660s is what's called the interregnum. It is a period between monarchies, a period when strict, oppressive law and terror to those who don't follow the strict, oppressive law reigned in Renaissance England. The 1950s are the interregnum for the comic book industry. And then something happens. In 1958, two things happen, actually. One, DC Comics reintroduces The Flash. Like so many other characters, Hawkman, Plastic Man, let alone Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Arrow, Martian Manhunter, and on, The Flash was birthed in the late 1930s, early 1940s, okay, as a superhero. And his origins were basically magic. In 1958, in an issue of Showcase, a brand new Flash is introduced, and his origins are in science. Because now, kids and teenagers in the late 1950s, these are people who have been born into and are growing up under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Magic doesn't cut it. Not when you know that science can destroy all life on Earth, and there's not a darn thing that you can do about it. And you can conduct drills in the schoolroom all you want, hide under your desks. It's not going to make a damn bit of difference. You'll still be ashes if a nuclear bomb goes off within 100 miles of you. So this is a generation raised in science, and comic books now turn toward science, okay? So superheroes are kind of new again. So this starts 1958. The story is called The Flash of Two Worlds. I'll try to get a PDF of that for you to read because it's important. The other thing that happens that brings comic books into what we call the Silver Age, 1958 through about 1970, the Silver Age. Jerry Siegel in 1958, 1959 starts writing Superman again for DC Comics. And Jerry Siegel goes where he had never gone before in the Superman stories. We talked about this in class. The early Superman stories, they were violent. Superman was brash. He was not afraid of violence. He was charismatic. He was invulnerable. Well, he was Superman, okay? If you're Superman, what do you have to be afraid of? What do you have to be unhappy about? Because you're Superman. The Superman that Jerry Siegel creates in 1958, 1959, and then works with into the early 60s is a different Superman. Instead of focusing on Superman performing amazing feats of strength or speed or whatever, There's not much left to do there because in the previous 20 years, Superman had been given all manner of powers. He was essentially a god. There's nothing left physically for Superman to do that required any imagination or would be at all thrilling or entertaining. So Jerry Siegel, instead of writing a Superman who is the savior of the day, zeroes in on the fact that Superman is the last member of his species. He is the sole survivor of his planet. And Jerry Siegel essentially says, what would that feel like? The answer is that wouldn't feel very good. So the Superman of Jerry Siegel's stories in the late 50s and early 60s is far more introspective, far more, if we want to use this word this way, mature than the early Superman. Now, Superman doesn't remain the final member of his species for very long. There's the Bottle City of Kandor, a miniaturized city full of Kryptonians that Superman somehow has in his Arctic apartment, the Fortress of Solitude. Supergirl appears. Okay, Superman's cousin. There's Superboy. Okay, well, who is just Superman as a boy. And in fact, in Superboy's early comic books, the title was Superboy, The Adventures of Superman When He Was a Boy. Descriptive, you gotta give it that, okay? But Siegel's stories were very different from anything he had done before, okay?